He only meant to help an old man stand up. But what followed, one trembling note, one forgotten name, and one song no one could stop crying over, would heal a town, reunite a family, and prove that even in silence, love can still sing. If stories like this touch something deep inside you, we'd be honored to have you with us. Subscribe for more real stories that remind us all kindness is never wasted. Now, let me tell you what happened the night a single dad gave a violin back to history. The wind was dry that morning in Kansas. Not cruel, just old. It carried with it the sound of creaking flagpoles, the sharp snap of American banners, and the low murmur of a gathering town preparing for its annual Veterans Day parade. Jonas Weaver stood near the edge of the main street, holding his 8-year-old daughter Maddie on his shoulders. His breath steamed faintly in the cold air, rising like smoke, before disappearing into a sky the color of faded denim. His flannel jacket was worn at the cuffs, and the name patch stitched above his chest pocket had long since faded. But he still wore it out of habit, out of memory, and maybe out of hope that Maddie would see in him the kind of man he used to be. A trumpet blared in the distance. The parade was starting. Maddie clapped her mittens and whispered, "Here they come, Daddy." Jonas smiled. "Eyes wide now, baby girl. These are the real heroes." He meant it. Every step of the honor guard, every flag held by trembling hands, every wheelchair that rolled forward, he saw stories. Wounds, sacrifices, men and women who'd walked away from war but never left it behind. And then it happened. A figure stumbled forward just past the cordoned line of folding chairs near the reviewing stand. It was an old man, very old, his thin frame lost in an oversized military coat. He clutched a faded cap in one hand, the words, "Hiroshima survivor, 1945, embroidered in trembling thread. His knees buckled. People gasped, but no one moved. The old man crumpled slowly, painfully onto the pavement. For a moment, time stalled. A few in the crowd looked away. A man behind Jonas muttered, "He's probably just confused." Happens. Jonas felt Maddie shift on his shoulders. Her small voice cut through the cold. "Daddy, he's hurt. Why isn't anyone helping?" Jonas didn't answer. He just bent down, let Maddie slide off his back, and walked into the street, straight through the line of stunned spectators and into the path of the oncoming parade. "Sir," a volunteer in a safety vest called out, but Jonas didn't stop. He reached the old man, knelt beside him, and saw the dazed, glassy eyes. The man's lips moved barely audible. "I just wanted to stand with them." Jonas's throat tightened. Gently, he slipped out of his jacket, folded it, and placed it beneath the man's head. He glanced up. People were watching now, dozens of them. Silent, frozen. He leaned close and whispered, "I've got you, sir. You're not alone." Then, with both arms and all the care he had left, Jonas lifted the old man to his feet. It wasn't easy. The man was lighter than expected, but the weight wasn't physical. It was history, memory. 78 years of survival pressing down. A police officer jogged over, reaching for Jonas's arm. "You can't. This is a restricted." Jonas met his eyes and said firmly, "He's a Hiroshima survivor. He came to honor his brothers. If there's a seat on that platform that means anything, it's his." The officer blinked, then nodded. The crowd parted. Jonas carried the man toward the raised platform at the front of the viewing area. A line of elderly veterans in uniform watched. One of them in a wheelchair tapped the space beside him. "Sit him here. I've been waiting." Jonas gently set the man down. The old veteran beside him reached over and took his hand. Then something extraordinary happened. A little girl no more than 6 stepped from the front row of the crowd. She held a small, neatly folded American flag in her mittened hands. Without a word, she climbed the steps and placed it in the lap of the old man. His fingers curled around it slowly. He bowed his head. A tear rolled down his cheek. No music played. No speech was made. But in that silence, something far louder filled the street. Maddie ran up to Jonas, eyes wide. "Daddy, why are people crying?" He looked around. Dozens, maybe hundreds now, had tears in their eyes. Veterans, teachers, teenagers, grocery clerks, people who had come for a parade and witnessed a moment of grace, because Jonas said, quietly kneeling beside his daughter, "Sometimes kindness makes more noise than drums." The warmth of Jonas's small living room was almost too much after the chill of the parade. Maddie had fallen asleep on the couch, cradled in a quilt that still smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. A kettle hissed softly on the stove. Jonas poured 2 mugs of tea, setting one on the table near the old man, who now sat quietly in an armchair by the window. Outside, snow threatened. A fine dusting of flurries had begun to settle on the empty street. "I didn't mean to cause a scene," the old man said. Finally, his voice barely louder than the ticking of the clock above the mantel. Jonas sat across from him, hands wrapped around the warmth of his mug. "You didn't," he replied. "You reminded people what this day really means." The man gave a weary smile. "Most folks don't know how to look at someone like me. Not anymore. I don't even know how to look at myself." Jonas leaned forward slightly. "My name's Jonas Weaver. That's my daughter Maddie. What's your name, sir?" There was a pause, a long one. Then quietly the man said, "Kazuo Mori." Jonas nodded once. "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Mori." Kazuo didn't respond right away. His eyes drifted to the window, watching the snow swirl. "I used to play violin. Once. Before everything." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out something small wrapped in wax paper. Carefully, he unfolded it. Inside was a photograph creased 100 times over the edges, worn thin. It showed a group of children in pressed uniforms standing on the steps of what looked like a music hall. In the center, a boy no older than 10 held a violin to his chin. "That's me," Kazuo whispered. "Taken in Hiroshima." Spring recital. 1942. Jonas felt his breath catch. He took the photo gently, as if it might crumble in his hands. After the bomb, Kazuo continued, voice brittle. There were no instruments left. No music. Just fire and silence. "I was lucky to be outside the city when it happened. I lived, but I stopped playing. I haven't touched a violin since that day." The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the weight of years of notes left unsung. Jonas stood slowly and walked over to a tall cabinet in the corner. He opened it with care. Inside, resting on a velvet-lined shelf, was a wooden case. Dusty, but intact. "My wife's," he said as he opened it. "She passed a few years back, played in the community orchestra here. This was her second love." Inside was a beautifully kept violin, the wood rich and warm even in the low light. Jonas carried it over and set it gently in front of Kazuo. He didn't say a word. Kazuo stared at the instrument. His hands trembled in his lap. "I can't," he murmured. "Not after all this time." Jonas just nodded, not pushing. He returned to his chair. The kettle whistled again, louder now, but neither man moved. "I was a music teacher," Kazuo said suddenly, as if the violin had unlocked something long buried. "Before the war. After. I tried to teach again in California, but no one wanted to learn from a Japanese man in 1947. I packed up and kept moving." Jonas swallowed hard. "That's wrong. And I'm sorry." Kazuo smiled faintly. "You weren't even born yet. But thank you." The violin sat untouched on the table, yet somehow its presence changed the air in the room. Do you know, Kazuo said, turning toward Jonas, what it feels like to have your voice buried inside you for 80 years? Jonas hesitated, then nodded. Maybe not for 80. But yes, I think I do. Kazuo looked at him closely, not just at his face, but at his posture, his hands, the quiet fatigue in his eyes. You lost someone, he said. My wife, and before her myself. That answer needed no further explanation. They sat like that for a long time. 2 men, 2 histories, 1 silence. Then Kazuo did something neither expected. He reached out and rested his hand on the violin case, just his fingers gently. It still sings, he said softly. Even if I don't. Jonas blinked away the wetness forming at the corners of his eyes. I think he said carefully that maybe it's been waiting. Just like you. Kazuo nodded slowly, his hand still resting on the case. He didn't open it. Not yet. But the gesture, however small, was the first note of something new. Outside, the snow continued to fall. But inside, for the first time in decades, there was the faintest sound of hope stirring in the silence. The violin sat untouched for 3 days. Jonas didn't rush him. He simply kept the case in the same spot on the small table by the window, where the morning light could gently rest on its polished wood. Sometimes Kazuo would glance at it while sipping his tea. Other times he would sit silently staring through the glass as snowflakes danced across the empty street. But he never reached for it again. Until one night. Jonas had just finished tucking Maddie into bed. She always insisted on 2 songs, one silly, one soft. That evening he sang her an old Appalachian lullaby, one his mother used to hum when he was small. As he sang, he noticed the bedroom door wasn't fully closed. In the sliver of hallway beyond it, Kazuo stood. He wasn't staring at Jonas, nor at Maddie, but somewhere else entirely, into a memory the song had stirred. After Jonas finished the lullaby and kissed Maddie's forehead, he stepped into the hallway. Kazuo's eyes were misted. You know that tune? Jonas asked gently. The older man nodded. We had a melody like that in our village, though the rhythm was different. But the shape of it, the heart, it's the same. They walked back to the living room. It was late. The fire had dimmed to embers, but neither man made a move to go to sleep. Jonas poured 2 fingers of scotch into a pair of mismatched glasses and handed one to Kazuo. To lost songs, he said. Kazuo clinked his glass lightly, and the courage to sing them again. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was something more sacred, like the tuning of strings before the first note. Then Kazuo stood. He walked slowly to the violin case, his movements careful, deliberate, as if approaching an altar. His hands paused above the latches, fingers trembling. Jonas held his breath. With a quiet click, Kazuo opened the case. The violin was just as Jonas had left it, but now somehow it felt different, like it had been waiting. Kazuo didn't lift it yet. Instead, he took out the bow first, inspecting the horsehair running his fingers over the old wood, like greeting an old friend after a lifetime apart. Then he picked up the instrument. It fit in his hands in a way that was almost holy. He raised it beneath his chin, eyes closed, and for a moment, nothing. Then a single note. Soft, low, and fragile. It wavered at first like breath in cold air. Then another note followed. And another. Jonas sat frozen glass, untouched. The sound that filled the room wasn't polished. It wasn't powerful. But it was real. Kazuo moved through a slow scale, and then he began to play something else. A tune, neither classical nor folk. Something ancient, but still breathing. Jonas recognized its shape, minor intervals, a sorrowful curve, but the melody was unfamiliar. It wasn't Western. It wasn't American. It was Kazuo. He played for several minutes, eyes still shut. When he finished, the final note hung in the room like the last breath of a prayer. Jonas swallowed hard. What was that? Kazuo opened his eyes. A hymn we sang after funerals. But this was something else. It came out on its own. He placed the violin gently back in its case, then looked at Jonas. You play too. It wasn't a question. Jonas nodded. Guitar. Used to sing at church, and with my wife. Kazuo's gaze didn't waver. Then we should write something together. Something not hers. Not mine. Ours. The proposition startled Jonas. A song, a new one, Kazuo said. One built from both sides of the world. Jonas chuckled softly, rubbing the back of his neck. It's been a long time since I wrote anything worth hearing. Kazuo smiled. So has it been for me. They began the next morning. Jonas brought out his guitar, the one with a cracked body and worn strings that somehow still held perfect tune. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, Kazuo with a pencil and staff paper, Jonas with a mug of coffee and a notebook. The process was awkward at first. Kazuo's musical training was precise, classical. Jonas's instincts were looser, guided by gut and story. But somewhere in the space between something started to form. It wasn't beautiful yet, but it was alive. They built it slowly, like threading history through melody. Kazuo suggested a pentatonic motif that reminded him of a river in Kyoto. Jonas layered soft chord progressions under it that felt like the hills of Tennessee. As days passed, the song began to take shape. They titled it, Ashes into Hope. Not because it sounded triumphant, but because it didn't. It sounded human. The first time they played it from beginning to end, Jonas sang quietly over the final bars. The lyrics were raw, barely polished, but true. From broken strings and burning skies, to lullabies and long goodbyes, we found our way on borrowed notes, through ashes into hope. Kazuo didn't speak afterward. He just reached across the table and gripped Jonas's hand. No one else was in the room. No one had heard it but them. But for the first time in decades, both men felt what they had once thought impossible. They had made something that couldn't be taken. 3 weeks before Christmas, the local pastor knocked on Jonas's door. Reverend Mark Hadley was in his 60s, tall and gentle-voiced, with the kind of presence that made even silence feel like a prayer. He had served the town's only Methodist church for over 30 years. When he heard about what happened on Veterans Day and the old man with the violin, he decided to see it for himself. Jonas opened the door, guitar still slung over his shoulder, sweat on his brow from the practice session he and Kazuo had just finished. Pastor Hadley Jonas said, a little surprised. It's been a while. The Reverend offered a warm smile. Heard music coming from this house again. I figured that was worth investigating. Jonas stepped aside. Come on in. I'll introduce you to the source. Kazuo stood when the pastor entered. Though his posture was still thin, his presence had shifted. He carried himself with more breath, more steadiness. This is Mr. Mori Jonas said. Kazuo. The two men shook hands, and for a brief moment neither said anything. Then Pastor Hadley looked at the violin case and smiled. I saw a boy once years ago who played the violin like it was part of his own body. I've been waiting to hear that sound again. Kazuo bowed his head slightly. I've been waiting to let it out. They talked for an hour. Kazuo shared little bits of the song he and Jonas had been writing. The pastor listened, eyes soft, hands folded. When Kazuo played the intro, just the soft, tentative notes of the first bars, the pastor blinked hard and cleared his throat. I don't know what it is, he whispered, but there's something sacred in it. Jonas leaned forward. We've been thinking about playing it publicly. One time. Quiet. just to give it away. The pastor's eyes lit up. "We're planning a community candlelight service next Saturday," he said. "No big production, just music remembrance and a little hope before the holidays. I'd be honored truly if you both would play." Kazuo hesitated. His fingers curled slightly, as if remembering old injuries that lived in the bone. But then he looked at Jonas, and something softened in his expression. "If it's meant to bring healing," he said, "then I will play." The church was small, just 8 rows of pine benches and a modest wooden cross over the altar. But on that night, every seat was filled. Even the side walls were lined with neighbors who stood quietly holding candles, their faces warm in the glow. Maddie sat in the front pew, bundled in her green coat, eyes wide and still. Jonas adjusted the mic stand, gently checked the tuning of his guitar one more time, and nodded toward Kazuo. Kazuo took a single breath. He stepped forward, violin in hand, and raised it beneath his chin. The silence was total. Then, with a trembling bow, he began to play. The opening notes of Ashes into Hope drifted through the sanctuary, like breath through winter trees. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Each note carried a weight of decades of silence, of survival, of unspoken sorrow turned into sound. Jonas joined on guitar the soft strum like heartbeat beneath melody. Then slowly he began to sing, from broken strings and burning skies to lullabies and long goodbyes. We found our way on borrowed notes through ashes into hope. No one moved. Some people closed their eyes. Others wept silently the way people do when they recognize something they've lost but never had words for. In the back row, a young widow held her infant child and sobbed into the baby's blanket. An elderly Vietnam veteran stood against the wall, hand on heart, eyes fixed on the strings of Kazuo's bow. At the final verse, Kazuo did something he hadn't done in 70 years. He sang. It was no more than a whisper, his voice aged and frayed like the pages of an old hymn book, but it was there. It rose at the final phrase mingled with Jonas's, and when the last chord faded, the entire church sat in absolute sacred silence. And then someone stood, not to clap, just to stand, and then another, and another. Until the whole room was on its feet, heads bowed, candles still burning like a prayer no one wanted to end. Later that night, back at the house, Jonas tucked Maddie in with extra care. She clung to his hand a moment longer than usual. "Daddy," she whispered. "Yes, sweetheart. That song. It made me feel like the whole world was hugging each other." Jonas smiled, heart-catching. "Me too." Downstairs, Kazuo sat by the fire, the violin resting gently on his lap. He didn't say anything when Jonas joined him, just nodded. Then quietly, he said, "I thought I had nothing left to offer this country. Turns out I was just waiting for the right time." Jonas stared into the flames. "No, you were the right time." Outside, the snow began again, soft, quiet, covering everything with newness. And inside that little house, 2 men, one who had almost given up, and one who had nearly forgotten how to begin, sat side by side, no longer strangers. Just music, just memory, and the quiet echo of something far greater than both. The town hall had never hosted a crowd this large. It wasn't a grand venue, just an old brick building with creaky floors, mismatched chairs, and a makeshift wooden stage that had seen more PTA meetings and bake sales than standing ovations. But that night, the wall seemed to breathe with anticipation. Jonas stood backstage, hands resting on his guitar case, heart thudding a little too hard against his ribs. His shirt collar felt too tight. His fingers, usually steady, were oddly cold. Across the room, Kazuo sat silently on a wooden stool, violin on his lap. Eyes closed. He looked calm. But Jonas knew better. The older man had polished the violin 3 times in the last hour and hadn't touched his tea. They hadn't planned for this. After the candlelight performance at the church, word had spread like wildfire. Someone had recorded the moment on their phone. The video, shaky and dimly lit, captured the full performance of Ashes into Hope. Within days it had reached tens of thousands. But that wasn't the reason they agreed to perform again. It was the letters. Letters from people who had lost someone, from veterans, from children who had never met their grandparents, from widows, from strangers. They wrote about healing, about how the song felt like someone finally said out loud what they themselves couldn't find the words for. And so when the town's mayor asked if they would perform at the winter community gathering, they couldn't say no. The lights dimmed. A hush swept over the room. Jonas glanced toward Kazuo, who opened his eyes slowly and gave a small nod. They walked out together, not as performers, not as a veteran and a single father, but simply as 2 men who had found their way back to music and to each other. There was no fanfare, no introduction, just a stool, a mic stand, and 2 chairs beneath a string of warm white lights. Jonas adjusted the guitar strap over his shoulder. Kazuo lifted the violin beneath his chin, and they began. The opening notes were almost too soft to hear gentle tremors of melody that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. The bow danced across the strings, finding its voice 1 measure at a time. Jonas followed with a delicate finger-picked pattern, laying the foundation with chords that felt like home. Then came the first verse. From broken strings and burning skies to lullabies and long goodbyes. Jonas's voice was quiet, steady, worn like an old flannel ruff in edges, but warm at the core. The audience was utterly still. No coughing, no shuffling, not even the creak of a chair. When the second verse came, Kazuo joined in, not with words, but with a rising violin harmony that wrapped itself around Jonas's voice like smoke curling through morning air. By the time they reached the bridge, something intangible had filled the room. Grief. Yes, but also grace. Forgiveness. Memory. Something that didn't have a name but could only be felt. And then the final chorus. Jonas sang alone at first voice, dipping low. We found our way on borrowed notes. Then Kazuo's voice joined, soft, weathered, and pure. Through ashes, into hope. The final note lingered, held by the violin, trembling but steady, as if refusing to fade, until every soul had caught it. And when silence finally fell, it wasn't just still. It was sacred. No one clapped. Not at first. For a long moment, the entire room seemed frozen in time, held together by something deeper than applause. Then someone in the front row stood up, not to cheer, but to wipe their eyes. Another stood. Then another. And like a wave, the whole room rose to its feet. Still no cheers, no whistles, just tears and the hush of shared understanding. It wasn't a performance. It was communion. Backstage afterward, Jonas sat on a bench, tuning peg and hand breath still uneven. Kazuo walked over, towel in hand, and sat beside him. You sang it different tonight, the older man said. Jonas nodded. Felt different, like it wasn't just ours anymore. Kazuo looked out toward the now empty hall. It never was. Jonas smiled faintly. I used to think music was about sound. Notes, technique. But this, it's about remembering, Kazuo said quietly, and letting go. They sat in silence for a long while. Then Jonas asked, would you ever do it again? For more people. Kazuo gave a small shrug, then grinned. If they're willing to listen. Jonas chuckled. I think they are. Later that evening, after Maddie had fallen asleep on the back seat of the truck, still humming the song under her breath, Jonas drove Kazuo home through the quiet streets of town. Snow had begun to fall again, thick, steady, covering the sidewalks and the rooftops in white. "You know," Jonas said softly, "eyes on the road, I think tonight might have been the first time I felt proud of myself in a long time." Kazuo leaned his head back, voice gentle. "You gave people something no one else could a reason to remember and to forgive." Jonas didn't respond right away, but when he finally spoke, it was only 2 words: "Thank you." Kazuo looked at him and nodded, eyes misted. "No." He whispered thank you for stepping forward when no one else did. It started with a letter. A woman named Helen Prescott, 76 years old, wrote to the local paper. "I haven't cried like that in 40 years, she wrote. "Not since the day they folded my husband's flag and handed it to me." That song brought him back, not in body, but in something deeper. In the way I remember his smile, the way he used to whistle when he thought no one was listening. The paper printed it in full on the front page. Within a week, dozens more followed. Veterans wrote in, some for the first time in their lives. Widows, grandchildren of men who never came back. People who had never touched a musical instrument, saying they now found themselves humming that melody while washing dishes or walking the dog. They didn't call it a performance anymore. They called it the moment. And from that moment, something began to shift in town. The first change was at the Veterans Memorial. It had always been clean, properly kept, but quiet. Tidy. Unnoticed. Then someone no one ever admitted who placed a copy of the ashes into Hope lyrics inside a glass frame and mounted it next to the list of names carved in stone. Within days, small tokens began to appear. Flowers folded, flags, old medals, a child's drawing of a violin. Someone left a cassette tape with "To Dad" from your boy written in red pen. Jonas drove by one morning and had to pull over. He sat in his truck for 15 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching a woman in her 80s lay a single rose on the ground and press her forehead gently against the marble. Then came the school choir. Ms. Barrington, the high school music teacher, approached Jonas and Kazuo with trembling excitement. She had heard the song, taught it to her students, and asked almost breathlessly if the 2 of them would come and speak to her class. Jonas hesitated. Kazuo, to everyone's surprise, said yes immediately. "It's not about performance," he said. "It's about remembering where music comes from and what it's for." So they went. It was a rainy Wednesday when they stepped into the old band room. Dozens of students sat scattered across plastic chairs, slouched, and skeptical in the way teenagers often are. Until Kazuo opened the case. He didn't speak much that day. He didn't need to. He played the first 4 notes, and the room changed. Jonas told their story not as a speech, but as a conversation. About grief, about war, about losing and finding things you thought were gone forever. And then when they played the song together, something astonishing happened. Halfway through the chorus, the students began to sing along. Softly at first, then with confidence. Some had tears in their eyes. Some just closed them and let the sound carry them somewhere else. Afterward, a girl named Lucy, no older than 16, walked up to Kazuo with trembling hands and said, "I didn't know my grandfather. But tonight, I feel like I met him." Kazuo bowed. So did Jonas. Back at home, Jonas's answering machine filled with messages. A local news station wanted an interview. A church in the next town asked if they'd come play. An arts foundation offered to sponsor a community recording. Kazuo declined most of it. Gently. Kindly. He wasn't looking for fame. He was looking for peace. But he agreed to one thing: a free public concert open to anyone, but especially to those who had someone to remember. He called it the Gathering of Names. The town came out in full force. Old photos were pinned to cork boards across the hall, faces in uniform and graduation gowns on wedding days. Each name whispered a story. As the evening began, Jonas stepped forward and told the crowd, "This song doesn't belong to us anymore. It belongs to you. Sing if you want. Sit quietly if you need. But know you're not alone." They played Ashes into Hope with everything they had. Jonas's voice cracked on the second verse, but he kept going. Kazuo's bow slipped once, but he smiled through it. The crowd joined them softly, raggedly, reverently. And when the final note fell, it wasn't just a town that remembered. It was a town that had forgiven, that had healed. That had, through one act of kindness, and one old violin found its way back to something deeper. After the concert, as chairs were being folded and photos gathered, a boy no older than 10 approached Kazuo with a scrap of paper. "I wrote a song too," he said. "Because of you." Kazuo took it with both hands, as if it were gold. And in that moment, Jonas saw something in Kazuo's face that he hadn't seen before. Not gratitude, not peace, but wonder. That night, as snow fell gently outside, Jonas sat by the window with his guitar. Maddie curled beside him, fast asleep. He thought of everything this song had become: a tribute, a bridge, a lifeline, but most of all, a beginning. It arrived on a Wednesday, a plain white envelope with a soft smudge in the corner where snow had melted and dried. No return address. Just Kazuo's name, handwritten in delicate cursive across the center. Mr. Kazuo Mori, C.E.U.O. Jonas Weaver, 137 Maple Street, Willow Ridge. K.S. Jonas found it in the mailbox beneath a stack of community flyers and catalogs. Something about the script made his hand pause. It was neat, intentional, written by someone who had taken their time. He stepped inside and handed it to Kazuo, who sat in his usual place by the window, with a cup of jasmine tea cooling beside him. "This came for you," Jonas said quietly. Kazuo looked up, surprised. His name wasn't something that appeared in mailboxes anymore. He turned the envelope over once, then again. His fingers, though old, still moved with care. He opened it without tearing the paper. Inside was a single page. The handwriting was the same, soft, measured, the kind that came from a time before keyboards and texts. Jonas stepped back, instinctively giving the man privacy. But Kazuo's hand reached out, stopping him. "Stay," he said. Jonas sat. Kazuo unfolded the letter and began to read. The words came in a voice barely louder than the wind outside. "Dear Mr. Mori, I don't know if this letter will ever find you, but after seeing your face in the newspaper article about the Veterans Concert, I felt something stir in me I hadn't felt in years: hope. My name is Eleanor. I was born in Tokyo in 1946. My mother was American. My father, well, she never spoke of him. Only once when I was a teenager did she show me a photograph. A man holding a violin, a gentle smile. His name was Kazuo. I asked questions. Too many, I think. My mother cried, said it was war, said it was complicated, said love was not always enough. Then she burned the photograph. But I never forgot that name. Or that face. When I saw you older, yes, but unmistakable, I couldn't breathe. And when I heard the song you wrote, I wept. Not because it was sad, but because it felt like finding the missing line of a song I'd been humming my entire life. If you are the man from the photograph, then I believe you may be my father. And if you're not, then I thank you anyway for reminding me that not all music is lost. With hope, Eleanor. Kazuo's hands trembled slightly as he set the paper down. The room was quiet. Not heavy. Not cold. Just suspended. Jonas waited. I knew her mother, Kazuo said finally, his voice low, reverent. Her name was Margaret. She was a Red Cross nurse stationed near Hiroshima after the war. She played piano, had freckles like spilled sugar. He closed his eyes for a moment. We spent one summer together before her orders sent her home. She never told me she was pregnant. Jonas nodded slowly. She probably thought it would be safer that way. Those were different times. Kazuo looked down at his hands. So much time. Gone. And yet Jonas said gently, "She still found you." Or maybe the song did. Kazuo exhaled long and full. Then he picked up the letter again, read the final line, and said almost to himself, "If you are the man, then I believe." That evening, Kazuo sat by the fire with a notepad in his lap. Not to compose, but to reply. He wrote slowly, deliberately. He paused often, not because he didn't know what to say, but because the weight of saying it right mattered more than anything. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. Before sealing it, he looked at Jonas. "Do you mind driving me tomorrow?" he asked. "Of course not." To the address at the bottom, Kazuo added, "She left a note, just in case I wanted to meet." Jonas looked at the paper, then back at Kazuo. "You do?" Kazuo nodded. "I've carried silence too long. It's time to listen to someone else's song." The next day, they drove 3 towns over to a small, ivy-covered residence tucked between a post office and a family bakery. The mailbox read, E. Mitchell. Kazuo sat in the car for a long moment before stepping out. His hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his scarf. The door opened before they even reached it. A woman stood there, tall and silver-haired, holding a ceramic mug between her hands. She looked at Kazuo, the way someone looks at a painting they've studied their whole life and are just now seeing in person. Neither spoke. Then Eleanor stepped forward and whispered, I've been waiting for this moment my whole life." Kazuo nodded. "Me too." She held out her hand. He took it. Neither let go. They sat in her sunroom for hours. Jonas, at their request, stayed in the background. He watched from the kitchen as they traded memories, some shared, some only imagined. Kazuo pulled out the photograph he had kept folded in his coat pocket, the children's choir from 1942. He pointed to the boy with the violin. Eleanor touched the edge of the photo and smiled. "That's the same smile in the mirror," she whispered. By late afternoon, they weren't strangers anymore. They were a song unfinished, perhaps, but at last, written in the same key. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Eleanor asked, "Will you play again?" For me, Kazuo looked at Jonas, who had already picked up the guitar. He nodded, and in the golden light of reunion, father and daughter listened as ashes into hope once again found its way into the air this time, not just as music, but as a bridge long awaited. The sun had nearly set when Kazuo stepped into Eleanor's kitchen, holding a stack of worn sheet music tied with faded ribbon. His hands were steadier now than they had been in weeks, maybe years. He laid the bundle gently on the table between them. "These were written before you were born," he said softly. "I thought they were lost, but I kept them tucked in the lining of my suitcase all these years." Eleanor untied the ribbon and opened the top page. The ink had faded to a warm sepia, but the lines were neat and elegant, dancing across the staff like footsteps in the snow. She read the title aloud. To the daughter. "I never knew." Her breath caught. She touched the corner of the page, then looked up at him. "You wrote this for me. I wrote it, not knowing if I'd ever meet you. But I played it in my mind every year on your birthday, though I only guessed the date." Eleanor blinked, tears brimming but not falling. "You were there. In your way." Kazuo nodded, voice rough. Music kept me close to something I didn't have words for. They sat for a moment in shared quiet. No apologies, no explanations, just presence. Just time making room for what had always been missing. Jonas stayed in the next room, respectful of their space, but close enough if needed. He sipped coffee slowly, letting the moment wash over him like the gentle patter of rain. It felt sacred to witness not something to interfere with, but to hold reverently in the corners of his heart. Eleanor joined him after a while, sliding into the chair opposite. "He's everything I hoped," she said. Jonas smiled. "And you're everything he didn't dare hope for." She chuckled softly, then let the quiet settle again. "You know," she added, "I used to watch you and Maddie from a distance, before I knew who he really was, before any of this." Jonas raised an eyebrow. "You did," Eleanor nodded. "A friend told me about a widowed veteran raising a daughter on his own. Said he played guitar at open mic nights sometimes, only for a room of 3. I was curious. So I came, sat in the back, never said a word. He laughed, half shy, half stunned. Why didn't you ever say something? I didn't know if I had the right." She paused, then smiled. "And honestly, you looked like a man carrying a mountain. I figured I'd just be another pebble on your back." Jonas looked at her with something new in his gaze. "You wouldn't have been." That night, as snow began to settle across Eleanor's front yard, the 3 of them gathered around the upright piano in her parlor. Maddie had joined them, sleepy-eyed and curious, clutching a blanket and sipping cocoa. Kazuo played first his fingers, gentle but sure. Then Jonas picked up the melody on guitar, letting it drift into the corners of the room like a blessing. Finally, Eleanor added soft harmonies, tentative at first, then certain, her voice delicate as spun sugar. The room was filled with something bigger than music. It was reunion, restoration, the kind of grace that comes not from erasing the past, but from choosing to carry it forward with open hands. Over the next week, their routines blurred into something like family. Jonas would drive Maddie to school, then stop by Eleanor's home to check in on Kazuo. Some days they played. Others, they just sat in companionable silence, sipping tea and watching the birds return to the feeders Eleanor had hung outside. Maddie adored Eleanor, declaring her a grandma who smells like cookies and piano keys. Kazuo smiled more, laughed more. His eyes had lost that distant, shadowed sheen. And Jonas, he found himself lingering, helping with dishes, fixing a drafty window, bringing Eleanor her favorite peppermint chocolates without being asked. Their connection wasn't rushed. It didn't come with declarations or urgency. It came in pauses, glances, in the comfort of being quiet together. One evening as they walked side by side down a snowy path behind Eleanor's house, she looked at him and said, "You know, I never thought love could find me this late in life." Jonas looked up at the stars. I didn't either. And now she asked. He met her gaze, slow and steady. "Now I think, maybe love isn't late. Maybe it's just on time for a different part of the journey." She smiled, not the practiced, polite kind, but the kind that reached her eyes and stayed there. That night, Kazuo found an old envelope in the back of his suitcase. Inside were 2 pressed cherry blossom petals and a folded photograph of Margaret Eleanor's mother seated at a piano with a book of hymns open in front of her. He added a new photo beside it, taken that afternoon, of Eleanor and Jonas sitting on the porch, Maddie curled between them, her head in Eleanor's lap. He sealed both photos together in a fresh envelope and wrote on the front, "To the love that built this bridge. We are home now." Winter deepened. The trees outside Eleanor's home stood bare and resolute, their dark limbs stretched skyward like frozen prayers. Snow piled gently on windowsills and fences softening every edge of the world. Inside, however, warmth had found a permanent place. The days no longer felt borrowed. They felt natural. Jonas had begun arriving each morning just after Maddie was dropped off at school, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with a bundle of firewood over one shoulder, always with the kind of quiet that never needed to be explained. Kazuo's routine had settled into something almost sacred. He played every day, sometimes alone, sometimes alongside Jonas or Eleanor. Not always ashes into hope. New songs began to take shape, some without words, others with lyrics. Eleanor scribbled in the margins of old cookbooks when inspiration struck mid-recipe. There was music in the walls now, and in the pauses between notes. One morning, Jonas found Eleanor at the piano, glasses perched low on her nose, flipping through a dog-eared hymnal. The soft amber light of winter sun pooled across her lap. She didn't notice him at first. He stood in the doorway and watched. There was something disarmingly beautiful about the way she moved, measured, assured, completely at home within silence. When she finally noticed him, she smiled. "You look like someone who's just seen a ghost." "No," Jonas said, stepping closer. "Someone who's just remembered what peace looks like." She looked down at the keys. "It's strange, isn't it? I spent so much of my life filling every quiet moment with doing, with fixing, proving, surviving. But now the quiet sings he finished." She turned her head toward him. Her expression softened, and something unspoken passed between them. Something too deep for small talk, too fresh for grand confessions. He didn't touch her hand, but he wanted to, and she didn't move away. That afternoon, Maddie came home from school with a piece of paper clutched in both hands. "I wrote a poem," she announced, beaming. "Miss Fallon said it was good enough to read at assembly, but I want to read it for you first." They all gathered in the living room, Kazuo in his favorite chair, Jonas on the rug, Eleanor beside him with her arm around Maddie's shoulders. She cleared her throat, very official, and began. "Sometimes songs are made of notes, but sometimes they're made of hearts. Sometimes music comes from violins, but sometimes it just starts." She paused, looking up. "Keep going, Eleanor," whispered, eyes already glassy. Maddie smiled and read the last verse. "I used to think a family was who you looked like most. But maybe family's really just who holds you when you're close." No one said anything for a long moment. Then Kazuo, voice thick, said, "May, I keep that poem." Maddie grinned. "It's yours?" He folded the paper as if it were parchment, then slid it gently into the pocket of his coat, next to the cherry blossom photo. That night, Jonas lingered after dinner. He and Eleanor washed the dishes in comfortable silence, passing plates and glasses between them, like choreography. At one point, their hands met over a teacup. Neither moved. Jonas looked at her. Really looked. "I don't want to rush you," he said softly. "I know," she replied. "But I also don't want to keep pretending I don't feel what I feel." Eleanor leaned against the counter. "I thought I'd buried that part of myself." Jonas chuckled gently. "Me too." She looked down, then up again, her voice steadier than he expected. "What are we, Jonas?" He paused, then answered with the honesty of a man who had lost and learned to love again. "I think we're two people who thought our stories were finished, and now realize we were just between chapters." She smiled at that. Then, slowly, she reached up and brushed a lock of his hair behind his ear, a gesture so tender, so ordinary, it nearly undid him. Kazuo watched them from the sitting room. He didn't intrude. He didn't need to. He simply smiled, bowed his head, and whispered to himself, "Every note is finding its way." Later, as the fire burned low and the clock ticked toward midnight, Jonas sat beside Eleanor on the couch, Maddie sleeping across both their laps. He turned toward her and whispered, "Do you think we'll ever write a new song?" Eleanor tilted her head. "We already are. It just doesn't have a name yet." Jonas nodded, then closed his eyes and let the quiet turn into music. It was a Tuesday when Kazuo announced it. The morning sun spilled over the frost-laced windows, casting golden light across the breakfast table. Maddie was coloring quietly, Eleanor humming a gentle tune in the kitchen. Jonas sat reading the local newspaper, his glasses sliding low on his nose. Kazuo folded his hands neatly over his teacup and said in the calmest voice, "Imaginable, I'd like to play one last time." Everyone paused. Eleanor turned from the stove, spatula still in hand. "What do you mean?" "One last time," Kazuo smiled gently. "I don't mean I'll stop playing entirely. Just, I feel a certain chapter closing. This music we've built together, it started in silence. And now, I'd like to end it in stillness on my own terms." Jonas set his paper down. "You're not sick, are you?" Kazuo chuckled. "Not in any new way." "But you sound so final," Eleanor said, voice trembling just enough to betray her heart. He looked at each of them one by one. "I've spent my life carrying memories, like bricks in my coat. For decades I played, no music, spoke little, made no home. And then, I found all three under one roof." His eyes met Jonas's. "Some songs are meant to be played once, others twice. But this one, Ashes into Hope, was never just mine. It belongs to the world now." Maddie looked up from her drawing, her voice small. "Where will you play, Mr. Kazuo?" He smiled. "Right here, in our town, on the old bandstand in the square. Nothing fancy, just the song and whoever wants to hear it." Word spread faster than Jonas expected. Flyers appeared in coffee shops and libraries. Local radio picked up the story. People called from neighboring counties asking for directions, asking if they could bring instruments, candles, songs of their own. No one called it a concert. They called it the last performance. Not because Kazuo was dying, but because something about it felt like the kind of goodbye that only comes when something beautiful has fully bloomed. The day arrived crisp and windless. Snow had melted from the sidewalks, leaving only faint traces in the grass and around tree trunks. The square was already full by sunset. Families, veterans, teenagers, teachers, some from towns miles away. The bandstand had been swept clean. String lights draped gently across the beams, casting a soft amber glow. A single chair sat at its center, and beside it, a microphone stand, and the violin case that had now become legend. Kazuo arrived walking slowly, flanked by Jonas and Eleanor, with Maddie skipping just ahead, proudly holding the sheet music to Ashes into Hope like sacred text. He wore his best coat, a scarf Eleanor had knitted just for this night, and a small pin on his lapel, an origami crane made of silver. As he stepped onto the platform, the crowd fell utterly silent. Not the kind of silence that demanded applause, the kind that held its breath. Kazuo didn't speak. He sat down, opened the violin case, and took a single breath. Then he began. No intro. No warm-up. Just the bow, gliding with a grace that time had not erased. The first few notes rose soft and pure, dancing over the heads of the crowd, like snowflakes that refused to fall. The melody curled into the trees, into the bricks of the buildings, into the hearts of people who had never met him, but somehow knew him. Eleanor joined in next on piano placed just off to the side. Her hands moved like water, flowing around the notes, lifting them higher. Then Jonas added his guitar, gentle grounding, and his voice, weathered, warm, began the first verse. From broken strings and burning skies. Dozens in the crowd began to hum. Some sang. Some simply stood eyes, closed arms around each other. When the final chorus came, Kazuo played with his eyes shut. Not for show, but for memory. For Margaret. For the child he never held. For the silence he once thought would last forever. And when Jonas sang the last line, through ashes into hope, Kazuo played a single final note. It held for a second longer than expected, then faded. The crowd didn't move. Then someone in the back began to sing Amazing Grace, softly. Others joined. No microphone, no leader, just voices. Kazuo sat quietly, violin in his lap, tears on his cheeks, not from sorrow, but from knowing that the song had ended exactly where it needed to. That night, back at home, he sat beside the fire cradling a cup of tea. Eleanor handed him a blanket, kissed the top of his head, and left him in peace. Jonas stood in the doorway. "You all right?" he asked. Kazuo looked up, his eyes clearer than they'd ever been. "I've never been more all right." He gestured toward the violin now resting in its case. "Maybe it's time for someone else to carry the music forward." Jonas nodded slowly. "I think Maddie's already started." Kazuo smiled. "Yes, she has." And in the stillness that followed, something unspoken settled into the room. Something like a benediction, a final chord that didn't end in silence but in beginning. Spring arrived quietly that year. It came not with trumpets or fanfare, but with small, faithful signs, the slow thaw of soil, the returning chirp of robins, the way light lingered just a bit longer in the windows each evening. And with it came something else, an enduring sense that the song, though performed for the last time, had not ended. It had simply settled into the bones of the town, into its benches and brickwork, into the hearts of those who had heard it once, and never quite stopped hearing it since. On a soft April morning, Jonas stood in the town's community hall, now converted into a modest art center. Maddie, now 10, adjusted the microphone stand on the small stage, the corners of her mouth pressed together in concentration. "That's a little high, don't you think?" Jonas teased from the seats. Maddie rolled her eyes dramatically, something she had perfected. "I'm not 5 anymore, Dad." "No," he said, smiling gently. "You're not." She wore a simple white blouse and a green ribbon in her hair, the same color as the one Eleanor had worn the first night she sang harmony at the church. Kazuo's violin rested on a stand beside the piano. No one played it these days, but no one dared store it away either. It stayed there like a quiet blessing. Eleanor entered the hall, arms full of music sheets and warm muffins wrapped in linen. She moved with the gentle ease of someone who had finally grown into the life she was meant to live. She kissed Jonas's cheek as she passed and ruffled Maddie's hair, earning a small groan, a smile, and then a giggle. The three of them had long since stopped defining what they were. They simply were. A family. Chosen. Earned. Built from silence, stitched together by song. The town now held monthly gatherings of song, not formal concerts, but evenings where anyone could play, sing, or simply listen. The first song was always the same, Ashes into Hope. Sometimes sung in full, sometimes just hummed by a dozen voices in the crowd. And every time someone cried. Not from sadness, but from recognition. On the anniversary of Kazuo's last performance, the town unveiled a small stone bench beneath the cherry blossom tree in the park square. Etched into the stone were the words, "He taught us that silence can sing." And that hope, when shared, becomes a song that never ends. Below it, in smaller print, Kazuo Mori, musician, survivor, father, friend. Jonas sat there one afternoon, guitar on his knee, fingers drifting idly over the strings. Eleanor sat beside him, hand resting on his arm. They didn't talk much anymore about the past, not because it didn't matter, but because it had finally made peace with the present. And Maddie, bless her young, wise heart, had started writing songs of her own. One afternoon, she stood in the kitchen with her notebook open, brow furrowed, and asked Daddy, "How do you know if a song is finished?" Jonas thought for a moment, then answered, "When it doesn't belong just to you anymore." On a quiet Sunday, a letter arrived, addressed in handwriting Jonas didn't recognize. Inside was a photo, a boy about 16 playing a violin on a stage, marked Osaka Youth Ensemble. Behind him stood a banner, Ashes into Hope, Peace through Music. A note was paperclipped to the corner. "Dear Mr. Weaver, I found this violin in a music shop in Tokyo. The clerk said it was once owned by a man named Mori. He didn't remember the rest. But when I played it, something happened. My teacher asked me where I learned the melody. I said I didn't. It just came. They say some songs live inside the wood. I think this one lives in the heart. Thank you for keeping it alive. Kaito M." Jonas read the letter 3 times. Then he placed it beside Maddie's poem in the drawer of his writing desk. And that night, as the fire cracked softly and the stars blinked down from their quiet posts in the sky, he picked up his guitar. Eleanor hummed beside him. Maddie sang Eyes, Closed Arms wrapped around her knees. And together, as they had so many times before, they let the song rise. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. But it was whole. And it stayed. If this story touched your heart even just a little, we'd love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? It's always a joy to see how far kindness can travel. And if you believe in the kind of stories that bring us closer, remind us to pause, and maybe even wipe away a quiet tear. Feel free to subscribe. We'd be honored to share more moments like this with you. From all of us here, thank you truly for spending this time with us. Your presence means more than you know.